Dick Backert is a guy that I've heard speak once, and then I've heard a tape that I was real impressed by. It's some pretty wild stuff. As I've told most of y'all, you're going to get your hair blown back tonight. Dick is an Atlanta businessman. He has a lovely wife, Sharon, here, and 3 children, and he's concerned about what America is going to be like for his children and grandchildren. Most of you know that I had asked Larry McDonald to come here a couple of nights before he was killed, and of course couldn't make it. But I did want to have somebody that knew some of the same things that Larry McDonald knew. Dick was a friend of Larry McDonald, and knows a lot of the same things. He's going to give us a little talk on communism in America. I hope you'll all welcome Dick Backert.
Thank you very much. It's indeed a pleasure to be with you this evening. If I can find my notes, we'll launch. I was hoping Tom would perhaps give you a little bit more of my background. In addition to being a businessman in Atlanta, I'm also a part-time musician, amateur musician. I play an instrument called a Frenorton. It's 26 feet long, made of brass. Looks very much like a trumpet, with the exception that it has a mouthpiece on both ends. It's very popular in Washington for some reasons which I think will become obvious. The sound is achieved in a Frenorton by blowing on both mouthpieces simultaneously. It's a single-player instrument, so you can imagine what that might be like. Now, the sound is not terribly great, but there's a great deal of action on stage during a performance. I play in a Frenorton ensemble in Atlanta, and a couple of months ago I thought the sound was a little thin. We had 2 Frenortons and a snare drum, and I thought the addition of a harp would be a welcome addition, so we added a harp. And we had a tragedy several weeks ago when the second Frenorton player became confused during a spirited rendition of the Flight of the Bumblebee, and while running to the other end of his instrument, ran right through the harp. For those of you who would like to send your condolences, he's in rooms 5 through 33 in Crawford Long Hospital. I tell you that story just to simply let you know that I do have a sense of humor. Because the material we're going to deal with here this evening is not very humorous. I'm a fanatic, but then Noah was a fanatic about the flood. We're in trouble in America, and we're in trouble for a lot of reasons. I don't have all the answers, Lord knows, but I'm struggling for those answers, and I would like to encourage those of you in this room and others you might be able to reach to try to join us. But my topic this evening is communism in America. On the topic of communism in America, I have good news and I have bad news. First, the good news. Americans will never have to worry that communism will come to America. Which brings me to the bad news. Unfortunately, by and large, it's already here. Communism or socialism is a political economic system under which all property is controlled and owned by the state. Its half-brother is fascism, where property is owned privately, but its use is totally controlled by the state. Fascism is just a way station on the road to communism. World War II Italy was a textbook fascist state. The state told you who to hire, how much to pay them, what to manufacture, how much to charge for it, how much to pay for raw materials, who to sell it to, and when to deliver. Everything else was up to you. Can you think of any evidences of fascism in the United States today? But back to communism. Several terms are synonyms for communism. Due to the media job done on the average American, anybody who talks about communism belongs in a rubber room in Milledgeville. Socialism, collectivism, Marxism, Leninism, these are synonyms, and there are others, all mean essentially the same thing. You ask the average American if communism is a threat in America, and they'll probably laugh at you. Ask the same American, however, assuming he knows what the words really mean, how he feels about the inevitability of socialism, and how many of us have heard that from sociology and political science professors, and he'll agree that socialism is probably inevitable. But you need to remember that socialism and communism are simply different stages in the same system, and they're essentially identical. There is no individual liberty under either system. Lenin said that communism will triumph not so much by the labors of a dedicated cadre as by the exploitation of useful idiots. Lenin knew much about modern America. Or perhaps he simply read Thomas Jefferson, who said, quote, "Yes, we did produce a near-perfect republic, but will they keep it? Or will they, in the enjoyment of plenty, lose the memory of freedom? Material abundance without character is the path to destruction." Marxism is named for one Moses Levy, whose nom de plume, or pen name, was Karl Marx. The Communist Manifesto, published over his name in 1848, contains 10 planks necessary to achieve the perfect worker's paradise. I'll list them and give you my personal analysis of their applications in this country. Plank 1, abolition of property in land and application of all rents to public purposes. Fact: the federal government now owns property in this country equal to the land area east of the Mississippi River plus Texas. And most of the so-called private land is privately and publicly encumbered by debt and taxes, and therefore not really owned. It's simply occupied. One of my all-time favorite signs reads, "Government property, no trespassing." And the recent Supreme Court decision concerning property ownership in Hawaii should frighten all Americans, but no one seems to care. Plank 2, a heavy progressive or graduated income tax. Fact: those Americans foolish enough to continue producing now labor from January through the middle of June just to pay for government. Aren't you glad we're not getting all the government we're paying for? Yet. Plank 3, abolition of all rights of inheritance. Fact: inheritance taxes confiscate and redistribute vast amounts of wealth, mostly from the middle class. The Rockefellers, Kennedys, Carnegies, DuPonts, Mellons, Fords, you get the idea, escape all of that with their trusts and foundations. Plank 4, confiscation of property of all immigrants and rebels. Observation: consider what happens to the property of those our state declares to be illegal tax protesters, or tax rebels, in what a growing number of Americans now recognize to be a First Amendment petition for redress of the grievance of the taxes described in Plank 2. And isn't it interesting that supposed crimes against the regulators and controllers are now being punished as severely as crimes against persons and private property? Plank 5, centralization of the means of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank with state capital and an exclusive monopoly. Fact: we got the Federal Reserve System, our national bank, the same year we got the alleged income tax, 1913. They go hand in hand. They have to. In 1909, a European representative of the Rothschild banks, one Paul Moritz Warburg, came to this country to campaign for the Marxist national bank system. If the name Rothschild isn't familiar to you, it was Baron Rothschild who said that he didn't care who ruled a nation so long as he controlled the money. Paul Warburg was quoted at the time as having said the following: "We, the bankers of the world, shall charge the governments of the world interest on money we create from nothing." Are you starting to get some idea about who might have bankrolled Karl Marx? Let me inject at this point, I'm not here to insult anyone or offend anyone. If you're a banker here this evening, you're in the same jeopardy the rest of us are. When the Fed starts turning the screws on the discount rate and the little banks start to tumble, you folks may be hurt just as badly as the rest of us out here. The Federal Reserve answers to no one accountable to the people. It has never been audited and it pays no federal taxes. It is not federal. It's the banker's bank. It's owned by the banks. I spoke to the Treasury Tax Reform Committee here in Atlanta recently. Copies of my presentation are up here at the front if you'd like to have some. Lenin said the surest way to overturn an existing social order was to debauch the currency. Has our currency been debauched? Compare the dollar in 1974 with the dollar today, and I think you have your answer. And is our private capital, free enterprise social order being overturned? Although it's not as interesting as, say, Dale Murphy's batting average of the last Georgia football game, folks, you'd better find out what they've done to your money. Plank 6, control of the means of communication and transportation in the hands of the state. Observation: the major networks and most big city newspapers are controlled in varying degrees by the large money banking interests and the friends of paper money, about which Jefferson and other founders attempted to warn us. One bright spot, however, may be the recent move toward deregulation of transportation. I certainly hope that's what that means. Plank 7, Extension of factories and instruments of production owned by the state, and bringing into cultivation of wastelands and the improvement of the soil generally in accordance with a common plan. Now, who could fault that? Observation. The first 28 words of Plank 7 are simply camouflage for the three key words with which it ends: a common plan. Central state planning is a hallmark of communism. Can you think of any examples of central state planning in the United States? Plank 8, equal liability of all to labor. Establishment of industrial armies, especially for agriculture. Observation. The central bank created inflation has so eroded the traditional male breadwinner's ability to maintain the family living standard that the working mother has become the rule rather than the exception. Over 65% of all wives and mothers now work outside the home. You see, to overturn the social order left us by the founders, it is first necessary to destroy the basic building block of that system, the family. A byproduct of that phenomenon is a frightening number of formerly self-sufficient, self-reliant Americans who now view government as the provider of services previously performed by the family or the church or another free association organization. It is a textbook vicious circle, but of course it was engineered to be. Question: do the kids go to work to offset the inevitable and higher next round of inflation? And I guarantee it's coming. How about a job for the family dog? You may have to eat him, so don't toughen him up too much. And women in America now fill many traditional male jobs. If the ERA comes back, and I'm afraid it will, despite what its proponents may say, women will be thrust into military combat in one of the future wars, police actions, peacekeeping operations, or whatever our elitist rulers have planned for us. And I would remind you that there are no unemployment or welfare problems in the communist slave states. Everyone has a job, whether they want one or not. Plank 9. Combination of agriculture and manufacturing industries, gradual abolition of the distinction between town and country by a more equitable distribution of population over the country. Fact. A conversation with refugees from communism invariably elicits horror stories about how that plank was implemented in their nations. 2 million Cambodians, half the population, simply disappeared when the city dwellers were forced into the jungle where they died. Desperately ill patients were rolled out of the hospitals in their beds by their relatives into the jungles. It is appropriate to recall that our new friends, the Communist Chinese, who admit to murdering 64 million of their own people, supported the Khmer Rouge regime responsible for this humanitarian action. And the Soviet Union, because production on the collective farms was a sad joke, was finally forced to allow its people to farm up to 1 acre plots behind their homes and keep what they earned from those gardens. Today, 27% of the food in the USSR is grown on 1% of the arable land. Guess where that land is located? Could it be that even the second-generation slaves of the criminals in the Kremlin understand more about free market economic principles than many Americans? Maybe we will understand and practice them again after our little dalliance with socialism also fails, as it must. Plank 10. Free education for all children in public school. I didn't make these up. These are out of the Communist Manifesto. If you never read the document, you ought to do so. Free education for all children in public schools. Abolition of children's factory labor in its present form. Combination of education with industrial production, and it goes on from there. Observation: if you know anything at all about the real history of America under constitutional Republican foundations and have a child in the state school system, browse through his or her social studies or American history textbook and read a version of our history you may not recognize. There's a reason for that. The public schools are still applying the concepts of John Dewey, an avowed secular humanist, an admirer of Karl Marx, Lenin, and a supporter of the communist counter-revolution in Russia. And in the late 1800s, a man named Charles Beard and a dozen or so of his cronies set about the task of rewriting American history, quote, from a Marxist perspective. That's right. Much of our history was rewritten. If you're not yet angry about the theft of the birthright colonial Americans fought and died to give us, you haven't been listening. Let's now look at a few more of the literally thousands of coincidental and random political and economic events which have carried America so far from her constitutional moorings that the founders would certainly be jailed as radicals were they to return. In our discussion of the central bank called for in Plank 5, I referred to European banker Paul Warburg. Warburg had some very influential and powerful American friends, men like J.P. Morgan, Bernard Baruch, Jacob Schiff, Colonel Edward Mandell House, and Nelson Aldrich. If that last name has a familiar ring to it, it's because Nelson Aldrich was the maternal grandfather of one Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller. And of course, it's just coincidental that as the 16th Amendment, the income tax, was ostensibly fastened to the backs of most Americans, the tax-exempt Rockefeller, Carnegie, Mellon, Ford, and other foundations were safely in operation. Colonel Edward Mandell House is a most interesting but little-known historical character. When Woodrow Wilson was elected in 1912, he took Colonel House, whom he called his alter ego, into the White House with him. Nothing sinister there, right? Wrong. What your history books never told you was that House wrote a book called Philip Drew Administrator, in which he set forth a plan for the conquest of America under socialism as dreamed of by Karl Marx. He spoke of a conspiracy, his term, which would achieve that goal by electing U.S. presidents using deception concerning the candidates' real opinions and intentions. It is no longer a conspiracy, folks. A conspiracy is a secret plan for an evil purpose. They've been telling us for years what they're up to. We just haven't been listening, or we've chosen not to. I wish time permitted a more detailed discussion of this period, as it is critical to fully understand our history from then until now, since it was during that period when the Rockefeller-dominated Council on Foreign Relations was established. Oh yes, the CFR is housed in a building donated by the Rockefeller family. Of course, it's just coincidental that America got 2 planks of the Communist Manifesto in Wilson's first year in office. And it's just a fluke that World War I erupted in Wilson's administration. America's entry was catalyzed by the sinking of the Lusitania. The sinking of that ship is a fascinating study in how to start a war. I would urge you to study the real events which have since come out surrounding that incident. During World War I, those referred to earlier financed both sides, making incredible profits. That hundreds of thousands of the cream of American and European youth perished or were maimed was of no concern to these men. And it's just happenstance that during that war, the Russian communist counter-revolution occurred. And again, it's a trick of history that the communist revolutionary Leon Trotsky, living in exile in New York, boarded a ship on March 27, 1917, with some 20 million given him by a number of these same wealthy Americans to finance that counter-revolution in Russia. The ship stopped in Halifax, Nova Scotia, where the Canadian government quite sensibly arrested Trotsky and impounded the money. Trotsky had said many times that if he came to power in Russia, he would withdraw from the war with Germany, an action which would have allowed redeployment of divisions of German troops to the Western Front where they would kill Canadians. But the Canadians were forced to release Trotsky and the money, after word came through a British intermediary from the Wilson White House. And Lenin, who had been in exile in Switzerland, was safely transported across war-torn Europe in the famous sealed train, with 5 to 6 million in gold given him by European bankers, among whom was Max Warburg, Paul Warburg's brother, also an agent of the Rothschild interests. Not long after their arrival in Russia, Trotsky and Lenin recruited an army of paid thugs, quickly overthrew the Kerensky regime, and the first nation had fallen to communism. More importantly, however, the international banking interests had secured a home base for what was to be called international communism. Let's move forward through time now in passing up such interesting tidbits as the Great Depression, when the Fed strung everyone out on easy credit, then slammed on the brakes, driving the people of America and the world to a position where anything, even another war, was an acceptable cure. And the American people were also taught the lesson that the free enterprise, private capital system was not to be trusted, and maybe central control from Washington was better than another depression. And the mega banksters won again. Or how about FDR's boast that some of my best friends are communists? Or recent documentation by author John Toland that FDR had advanced warning about Pearl Harbor, but allowed it to occur, so America could be dragged into yet another world war, which would once again enrich the international bankers. The carnage meant nothing to any of these people. Was this what Jefferson was trying to tell us when he declared, quote, and these are Jefferson's words, not mine, "I consider banks and banking institutions more dangerous to our liberties than standing armies," close quotes. And we'll skip over Lend-Lease, during which literally tons of U.S. Patent Office documents and top-secret high technology and nuclear data and materials were flown to the Soviets on U.S. military aircraft, much of it at the orders of George C. Marshall, who earlier bragged that he had disarmed 32 divisions of nationalist Chinese forces with a stroke of a pen, thereby guaranteeing victory for the communist Chinese. but that's the subject of another talk. And who would be so crude as to bring up the conferences at Tehran, Yalta, and Potsdam, where the U.S. under FDR and Truman sold the people of Eastern Europe into slavery under Soviet communism? And if you don't think the real reason for World War II was to expand the Soviet Communist Empire, simply compare maps of Europe before and after World War II, and it becomes relatively clear who won that war. It was in this post-World War II period that the UN was established. This effort at destroying America's national sovereignty, unlike the unsuccessful post-World War I League of Nations, would be more easily sold to a now war-weary American people. A midwife at the birth of the UN was one Alger Hiss, trusted advisor to Franklin Roosevelt. Hiss later spent several years in prison as a convicted communist spy. The site of the United Nations at Turtle Bay was donated by the Rockefeller family. An irony of history is that it is the exact location of the British execution of the 19-year-old American patriot Nathan Hale, making a total mockery of his dying declaration that he regretted that he had but one life to give for his country. And who would be so unkind as to discuss the post-war Operation Keel Haul, during which only God knows how many Eastern Europeans were forcibly repatriated back behind the Iron Curtain by United States troops under presidential orders. One U.S. MP later told how his squad opened barracks after barracks to the incredible and heart-wrenching sight of prisoners slashing each other with shards of broken window glass, preferring to bleed to death to returning to Stalin's welcome. And with tears in his eyes, he watched several men thrust their heads through window panes and, turning them rapidly from side to side, press their jugular veins to the jagged glass. Those who lived were carried on stretchers to the waiting boxcars for the trip to Stalin's firing squads, gulags, or worse. In 1954, Mr. Norman Dodd, chief investigator for the Reese Congressional Committee investigating the tax-exempt foundations, met with one H. Rowan Gaither, head of the prestigious Ford Foundation. During that interview, Mr. Gaither told a shocked Norman Dodd that the Ford Foundation was, quote, still operating under directives from the White House to so alter life in the United States as to make possible a comfortable merger with the Soviet Union, close quotes. When Dodd asked Gaither if he would repeat that statement at a public hearing, Gaither replied, "This we would not think of doing." If you're not angry yet, you obviously still aren't listening. It would be also impolite to observe that General MacArthur's hands were tied during the UN police action in Korea, and he was literally prohibited from winning there. MacArthur had won Korea clear up to the Manchurian border, across which our new friends, the Communist Chinese, were massing divisions of troops. MacArthur asked Washington for approval to bomb the bridges over the Yalu River. Word came back from Washington, don't bomb the bridges. The Communist Chinese poured over them and, outnumbering our boys 20-1, killed the retreating Americans like fish in a barrel. We weren't beaten in Korea, we were betrayed. Had the Communists been stopped there probably wouldn't have been a Vietnam, and 57,000 Americans, and only God knows how many Vietnamese, would not have died there. And friends of mine like Ki Vu, currently living in Atlanta, and my other Vietnamese friends could be peaceably living their lives in the land of their birth. And Hungary. For months before the uprising, Radio Free Europe and Voice of America urged the Hungarian people to rise up with an implied promise of Western help. When they did revolt, stories flowed out of schoolboys throwing buckets of soap suds under the Russian tank treads to cause them to skid and crash. Other young people placed inverted dinner plates in front of the advancing tanks, tricking the drivers into thinking that they were mines, slowing them just enough to allow a Molotov cocktail to be thrown. On the outskirts of Budapest, a tank started up the road toward the top of a hill where some teenage freedom fighters had sought refuge. The 12-year-old boy at the base of the hill knew his sister was in that group. Knowing his sister would die unless she and her friends had time to escape, he bought that time by throwing himself in an explosive charge beneath the treads. Khrushchev held the Soviet reinforcements at the Hungarian border and waited to see what the West would do. A group of patriots captured the Budapest radio station and broadcast this message to their assumed allies in the West. For the love of Christ, will someone please help us? Washington's response was the following telegram, quote, the government of the United States looks with disfavor upon the presence of a government hostile to the interests of the Soviet Union on the borders of the Soviet Union, close quotes. Hungary borders the Soviet Union, and the Russian tanks rolled into Hungary and the revolt was crushed. In 1968, a similar attempt at revolt in Czechoslovakia was put down in an equally brutal manner. Again, the West did nothing, and the slaves of Eastern Europe finally got the message. America and the West will do nothing to help. There have been no serious attempts at revolt behind the Iron Curtain since. And how crass it would be to say that if we hadn't been lied to by the media and known that Fidel Castro had been a communist since he was 14, or if John Kennedy hadn't pulled the air cover at the Bay of Pigs, Henry Rodriguez and many of my other Cuban friends in the Cuban community wouldn't have to be working to prevent a repeat of that Cuban catastrophe here. And Afghanistan. Can anyone tell me why the American government is not at least furnishing weapons and ammunition to these brave people who, without our help and at incredible personal sacrifice, have just about stopped the Soviets in their tracks, but who, with our assistance, would probably send the communist criminals packing? It will warm your hearts to know that Soviet troops rolled into Afghanistan on a highway built with U.S. Army engineering assistance. And the trucks in which they rode were produced at the world's largest truck factory at the Kama River, built with U.S. taxpayer guaranteed loans made by the Rockefeller-controlled Chase Manhattan Bank and designed and equipped by the Swindle, Dressler, and Ford Motor Companies. And perhaps you recall that a certain obscure Columbia University and Council on Foreign Relations member named Zbigniew Brzezinski dropped in from literally nowhere to become Jimmy Carter's national security advisor. In his 1970 book, Between Two Ages, Brzezinski praised Marxism, declared the United States to be obsolete, and called for a world government. David Rockefeller read the book and formed the Trilateral Commission, appointing Brzezinski its first director. In 1973, an equally obscure former governor of this state, Jimmy Carter, was invited to be a founding member of the Trilateral Commission. Carter later wrote that he learned much from his association with the commission. He certainly did. Brzezinski later said that his relationship with Carter was that of teacher and pupil. The teacher was an admitted Marxist, and the pupil was the President of the United States. And there's much, much more. America is right now faced with a budget-busting defense buildup to offset the Soviet threat. That threat has Made in America stamped all over it. The Soviets were able to MIRV their ICBMs thanks to the precision Centelide B grinding machines sold them with Henry Kissinger's State Department blessing. This gave the Reds a tenfold or better increase in the accuracy of their warheads. Henry Kissinger was, and is again today, a Rockefeller employee. It pains me to tell you this, but the process continues under Ronald Reagan. I have the documentation to prove that and will furnish it to anyone interested in seeing it. If it still isn't clear what this material is doing in a talk entitled Communism in America, I'll explain. Since before its founding, international communism has had no better friend and ally than the government of the United States of America. About this time, some of you are probably saying, well, so what? Haven't the elite always run the world? To which I would answer, yes, they have. However, I would then remind you that with the notable exception of an approximate 150-year period on the North American continent, the history of the world has been one of slavery or servitude to this elite group. A question you then must ask yourself is, do I wish to live in bondage or commit my children to slavery? At the top of this presentation, I recited the 10 planks of the Communist Manifesto. Let me leave you with a positive action program for righting our present disastrous course. 1. Pray to God that enough of your fellow citizens develop the vision to see what is happening and are endowed with the moral courage to act, to halt the further destruction of our freedoms and those of people around the world, and the theft of our national sovereignty. Pray for those now under communist oppression that their oppressors and those who control the oppressors will see the evil in what they are doing and repent. Educate yourself on as many of the freedom issues as possible and become an influence and information center. Consider joining probably the finest educational organization engaged in this mortal struggle to preserve your liberties, the John Birch Society. I joined the Birch Society 7 years ago just to find out why the media dumped on them at every opportunity. What I learned made me decide to remain in. Benjamin Franklin said it well when he said, quote, "A nation of well-informed men, taught to know and prize the rights which God has given them, cannot be enslaved. It is in the region of ignorance that tyranny begins." We simply must replace that ignorance with knowledge and understanding and action. 4. Study and learn our Constitution, and more important, study the intent of the drafters of that precious document, so that when, for example, the Supreme Court, as it did in the Bob Jones, Hawaiian, the recent J.C. decisions, twists the intent of the founders to adhere to some new public policy or overriding public concern, you will at least be aware of what happened to another of your freedoms. And when you hear the media belittle the U.S. Constitution as outdated or not suited to a modern progressive society, ask yourself 4 questions. 1. Is this progressive society moving toward more individual freedom or less? 2. Has human nature really changed in 200 or even 2,000 years? 3. Does the age of a philosophy somehow make it worthless? And 4. Since portions of the Bible are well over 2,000 years old, is it 10 times worth less than the Constitution? If you're a Christian here tonight, you'd better think long and hard about that one. Point 5. Purge yourself of all traces of statist or collectivist attitudes. Remember that envy is one of the socialists' main weapons. And remember, too, that the 10th commandment says, "Thou shalt not covet." 6. Do not accept government benefits. It has been said very well that we don't so much need a tax revolt as we need a benefits revolt. 7. Stop worrying about the presidential race every 4 years. That office has been controlled since Wilson's first term or before. The action is in the House of Representatives, where the founders, in their wisdom, put the power of the federal purse in Article 1, Section 7, which says, all bills raising revenue shall originate in the House of Representatives. It doesn't really matter who the president is. It's great if he's a nice guy or a nice person. If Congress doesn't fund the program, it won't happen. No money, no program. The money's controlled in the House, and the founders send those people back to us every 2 years. The Ed Jenkinses, the Elliott Levitises, every 2 years to account to us for how they're spending our money. We apparently like the way they're spending our money. We keep sending them back. 8. Speaking of the presidency, this country did not begin as a democracy, despite Ronald Reagan's intentional, I think, misapplications of that term to our system. We are well into democracy, however, on our way toward anarchy, almost always the next step on our way to the final absolute totalitarianism and slavery. We started out as a republic. When you pledge allegiance to the flag, you pledge allegiance to the democracy for which it stands? No, you pledge to the republic for which it stands. That comes from 2 Latin words, res publicus, the public thing, the law, the Constitution. We are a nation of laws, the Constitution being the supreme law of the land, not a nation of men. If you're prepared to admit we're a democracy and in fact a nation of men, which men? The best example of a democracy is a lynch mob. If 50% plus 1 votes to hang, up he goes. It is pure majority rule. James Madison said this of democracy in the Federalist Papers, quote, "Democracy is as short in its life as it is violent in its death. We want nothing to do with democracy." So every time Ronnie says democracy, read republic. 9. Support only those candidates, especially for the United States House, who pledge to adhere to biblical and constitutional principles. And once they reach office, watch them like a hawk. If they veer off course and refuse to return, work to replace them. Let me say here that all lovers of liberty lost a good friend in Congress when Larry McDonald and 268 other innocent men, women, and children were mercilessly blasted from the night sky by a Soviet aircraft loaded with U.S. technology, by a Soviet pilot who probably had a belly full of Kansas wheat when he fired a missile guided to its defenseless target by a Western computer technology financed by U.S. taxpayer-subsidized loans. 10. Exercise your second and third votes by accepting jury duty when called. We have 3 votes in this country. One at the ballot box, 1 on the grand jury, and the 3rd on the trial jury. The jury is the most important final check of runaway tyrannical government in our system. If we foul up in the exercise of our first vote, we can, through a process called jury nullification, void bad law. Prohibition is an example. Long before Congress got around to its repeal, the people repealed it by simply refusing to indict or convict. It's happening right now in the income tax. Be warned, however, that judges and prosecutors will not tell you that you have that right. Duty to judge the facts of the case and the law. The Georgia Constitution, to its great credit, contains that very phrase, that the jury has not only the right to judge the facts of the case, but also the law. That means if it's bad law, no matter if he's guilty, if it's bad law, he walks. You have the right to put him back on the street. And if one of the prosecutors or somebody in the jury room or in the courtroom asks you what you think about the Constitution, tell them you think it's a fine newspaper. They don't want people on juries who understand the Constitution. They're dangerous to control of the system. If you choose to help in this frustrating and often thankless task of reversing these powerful forces, and they are powerful, remember KAL 007 and Larry McDonald, who was murdered by the communist thugs who are at this moment receiving aid and comfort from your government. The Constitution calls that treason. Why don't we enforce it? Lenin said, first we shall take Eastern Europe, then the masses of Asia, then we shall encircle that last bastion of capitalism, the United States. We will not have to attack. It will fall like overripe fruit into our hands. Lenin was wrong. They won't need to encircle us, although they have. They have simply bored from within. Those of you who know scriptures remember how if the watchman on the tower saw the sword coming and sounded the alarm and the people did nothing, their blood was on their heads. But if he failed to sound the alarm and the people perished, their blood was on his head. However the battle to save this country develops from this point onward, when it's over, I want no blood on my head. Now, if you want to know who's really responsible for the mess we're in, look in any mirror. They have simply done to us what we've allowed them to do. They must, however, be absolutely delighted at how easy we've made it for them. At Hosea 4:6, the prophet laments, "My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge." Those are the choices before us. Knowledge coupled with intelligent action, or destruction. I've just spent about half an hour describing how, unless stopped, the American dream will become a nightmare. Because of time constraints, I moved quickly through a program normally requiring at least several hours. If you're confused, I've achieved my goal. If you care about this country, about your children, about your grandchildren, you will turn that confusion into understanding and, God willing, positive action to help those of us already in the struggle to reach others. If, however, you do not care about those things, continue to do what most of you have been doing. Nothing. Someone once said freedom isn't free. The founding fathers understood that. They pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. They kept their pledge. Will we keep ours? I leave you with my prayer that we will. The alternative is much too grim to contemplate. I don't know who authored this particular little four-line piece I'm going to read, but it summarizes the history of all tyrannies. All men lose when freedom fails, and good men rot in filthy jails, and those who cried, "Appease, appease," are hanged by those who they tried to please. Thank you, and may God bless and save America. I'd be happy to field any questions if anyone has any of those critters out there.
I'd like to ask a question, please, sir.
Yes, sir.
The 12 Federal Reserve banks printing money. Why is it they are not audited?
That's the way they wrote the bill. That's the way they wrote the Federal Reserve Act. They exempted themselves from all outside audits procedures.
So they don't even have to be audited.
No requirement for an outside audit. They do internal audits to keep their own books in order, but they're responsible to no one who is ultimately accountable to people, the voters. They're a separate government. In fact, Congressman Wright Patman made that statement a number of years ago that we are controlled by a separate unelected government, the Federal Reserve.
That was 1913 under Woodrow Wilson?
Yes, sir. And you see, the Federal Reserve had to have the federal income tax right in connection with it for this reason. John Maynard Keynes, the father of the Keynesian economic system, and the father of our current inflation, knew that if you gave a group like the bankers the right to print money without any substance behind it, and you flooded the market with this money, you just threw it out into the general population for whatever use. and you didn't re-harvest that money periodically, the people would catch on to this whole inflationary scam, and that's exactly what it is. So every April 15th, we pony up. They don't need that money. They've got the unlimited right to print however much of that paper stuff they want. They don't need the Federal Reserve notes you send them every April 15th. They need that money, however, to vacuum it out of the system so you don't catch on and inflation doesn't go right through the roof. That's why we have April 15th every year. They don't need it. They just run the presses an extra day or two to cover the... They could cover the deficit tomorrow, but to do so would flood the country with valueless currency, and we'd all understand what's happening to us.
Yeah.
They don't want that.
I don't guess there's anything we can do to get it.
Yeah, we can elect some people to Congress with a spine to stand up to them,
Yeah.
and pray to God they don't get killed, as a number of congressmen have over the years. These boys play rough. There's a lot at stake.
Yeah.
Yes,
Does this mean that the deficit we hear so much about is harmless? Or what?
yes, sir. As a matter of fact, I'm glad you brought that point up. How many of you remember the name Reverend Bob Richards? Okay, he was the front man for Wheaties in General Mills, I think, for a number of years, but he was a two-time Olympic gold medal winner in pole vaulting, and he's since gone on to become the recently announced candidate for the Populist Party. Now, I've got some problems with some of their campaign planks. However, one of their campaign planks is repudiation of the national debt. And I think that's not a bad idea. I mean, who would really be hurt ultimately? It's the big international banking concerns who control this country, essentially. But that would be a responsible action by our government, and I don't think our government's capable of responsible action until we make them responsible. But yes, there's talk in that direction now. We've never heard it before, but it's very healthy.
Who do you like in Washington?
I wish they'd all go home. I'd pay them $65 grand a year to stay home. I believe it was Jefferson, a very wise man, said that no man's life or treasure is safe while the legislature meets.
Where would we go from there?
Well, what we need to do is become accountable for ourselves, responsible for ourselves, and that's ultimately what we are. Government, you see, has nothing except that which it takes from its citizens. If you consider capital to be the tools of the means of production, and that's the definition of capital. The ultimate capital items are man's mind, the inventions, the things he creates, and his hands. Now, they're robbing our capital from us, our labor, if you will, through this inflationary process. They're printing this money, they're sucking it back out of the system, they throw you in jail if you don't pay up your income tax every April 15th, or they're trying to, but that's out of control, frankly. Roscoe Egger said 35 million people who filed in '82 didn't file in '83. That's up about 15 million from the previous year, and it's getting worse, folks, I guarantee it. They're working their agents to death trying to stay on top of it, and they can't. We're going to see meaningful changes in the income tax system, but be alert to a sham, a shell game. We don't want to trade what we've got for something worse. Stay plugged into Tom, because Tom Hardigree here is, I think, probably one of the key information centers in this area, by virtue of his connection to some of the same sources I have. But in terms of where we ought to go, I think we ought to go back and read the Constitution, sir. Understand what that system was to have given us. Constitution does not guarantee rights. We have rights from God. Our rights come from God. That's the first time that's ever been said in a nation, at the foundation of a country. The Constitution limits government. You see, God created man. Man created a Constitution. The Constitution created the government. And then the government hired a bunch of bureaucrats to run around and do those few things which the Constitution said they could do. National defense, protect us in a court, give us a court system so that we could protect ourselves from the bad guys. Just a few minor things. Post roads. Go back to the Constitution, see what it says. They've got no business in any of this other stuff. 60% of the federal government's activity today is income redistribution. Transfer payments. You send it up there, they send it back to somebody else who can't or won't work for a living. That's tyranny. That's plunder. Frederick Bastiat, if you've never read the book The Law, you should read the book by Frederick Bastiat by that title. It was written just after the French Revolution, and he described at that time precisely what's happening in America today. It's as timely today as it was when it was written. Legalized plunder of the productive middle class and the consequent destruction of the middle class. Any more questions? Tom, I'm sure, is in a position to field them later if you do develop some. Thank you. I appreciate having the chance to be with you.
Thanks a lot, Dick. Really appreciate you coming.